Okay, we're going to enter our Q&A section. The first participant in our Q&A I'm going to invite up is the Vice President and Partner at Diamond Ventures since 2001. She leads the company's government relations efforts, monitoring land use policies and regulations in more than 20 jurisdictions. Within Diamond Ventures' real estate portfolio, she handles special assignments, assessments, conducting research, and designing solutions to resolve issues within projects to allow them to move forward. She's a former Pima County Planning and Zoning Commissioner and has served on the Metropolitan Pima Alliance Board, the Tucson Hispanic Chamber, and SABA's Advisory Board. Please welcome Priscilla Storm. The next part of our panel will be Jim Portner. He has got 25 years of technical land planning, civil engineering management, and project leadership. He specializes in places where plans are not specific. He has been involved in a number of projects we would be aware of, some of those including Lawton Cantata's Lifestyle Center, the Bridges Planned Area Development, Tucson Marketplace, the Omni National Resort, the Super Target, and the Houghton Road Corridor Master Plan. Please welcome Jim Portner. Okay, this is our time to have the Q&A, and so I'd like to reach out to the audience for questions that you would have for our panelists.
Isn't one of the biggest hurdles perhaps you can't overcome for golf course reuse that it is statute that all the back taxes have to come back and revert back to property taxes, revert back to that property? I know in Phoenix it is that people want to shut down golf courses that get hit with $10 or $12 million property tax bills.
Others may know the answer to that better than I, but our problem with golf courses is not the back taxes issue. It's the fact that the demand for the golf course isn't there. And the prime example we have is the one that used to be located that I remember playing in 60-mile-an-hour gusts with a parka at Santa Rita Foothills. A lot of fun, but very difficult. That is basically mostly weeds now. And the problem is that we have with it is that, in effect, it's potential a fire safety issue. Whereas before you had nice manicured grass, you've got weeds as tall as me in some cases. I know that's not that tall, but so and then the second problem is that once you break it up, different golf courses are handled differently. Some of them have underlying land uses. Some of them were built as golf course overlays, but some of them do not. That one, in most cases, does not. So there is no land use on that property other than golf course in some cases. And then what do you do with it? How do you zone it? It's already been broken up and sold to various different people who want to come in and do things, and we go, okay, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this, and it's a pain. So I don't know if you guys know about the back tax issue.
No, I don't have any knowledge of the whole back tax and how you get out from underneath that, but I would tell you from my perspective, what we run into is the whole notion that when these projects, in my case, the golf courses are usually associated with the master plan development, so you got abutting residential. All of those abutting residential lots were lot premiumed as much as they could lot premium them. There's usually CC&Rs in place that the golf course will remain a golf course in perpetuity so that people can enjoy the benefit of the adjacency that they paid extra for. And it's navigating the whole mess of turning that around and what it does to people's property values and all of that, where basically it gets to be a really messy private matter between private parties, which is, to me, more of a hindrance than anything from the governmental or regulatory side of the equation.
I think that there's enough problems with golf courses throughout the state that every year, off session and during the legislative session, there's a lot of discussion about what needs to be done at the state legislature that would allow redevelopment of defunct golf courses at the state level. It is going to take providing some latitude and some process to resolve the deed restrictions and the CC&Rs and what you do with people that made investments in lots adjacent to golf courses that are now no longer functional and do become an attractive nuisance and a public safety problem. And I think that what the county has done is try to take a baby step towards saying, if there is a golf course that has become defunct, or there's an entitled golf course that could be repurposed for another use, we're going to try to open the window for a process to see what could be done with that.
I think the biggest issue is the disconnect between economic development and available infrastructure in many forms. One of the most obvious, one that Harlan I know is very familiar with, is in the Southwest, where for a long time that was a growth area identified by both the major utilities and the governmental districts. Still think of it that way, but now you have hurdles to development because of regulatory issues. I mean, number one being the city of Tucson saying we will no longer serve new projects outside of the existing city limits, even though all the infrastructure is already in place. So that's an existing issue, and how is that going to be resolved? And then in the future, the city of Tucson's focus is obviously the southeast, where they've annexed hundreds of miles of property, where by and large there is no infrastructure. And as you addressed, Harlan, there is nobody providing. Municipalities have never provided that, and the major utility companies do not provide that on their own. It's all come from the individual developer. And so for areas of that scale, even David Meal and the Dove Mountain concept, Bob Sharp and Sarita, even those wouldn't be significant, big enough to tackle something like that in the future, especially as we're trying to come out of a recession. So I appreciate everybody's comments on that conflict.
Jody?
Harlan, would you mind addressing quickly, like you did for the commission and other folks, how there was an attempt to work in a balance between the cost of development and what portion the developer, the private sector developer or private-public partnership would end up paying for versus the municipal entity for incentives and the balance of the cost to develop?
Let me touch base. I don't know if Tony wanted to answer for his, but let me address that just very, very briefly. Because my colleague in this project, Carla Blackwell, who has real life development experience, has a better handle on the full cost of development. And so I've leaned on her to explain all of that. But there are, what we try to do in the cost of development element, which is a required element that the state has us do, is to identify those strategies and those strategies that we have and that we will use in terms of funding the cost of new development. In many ways, those are borne by the developer primarily. In other cases, there are public-private partnerships that are available in one form or another. For example, as you all mostly know this, I'm sure, but I mean, you get credits for having put in and oversizing infrastructure, that sort of thing. And this is a really lousy response to this question, but if I were channeling Carl, I could do a much better job. These guys who do development, I don't know, you may want to talk about that.
I think the reality is that we have a very large delta between the infrastructure we need for economic development and the funding sources to pay for it. Very difficult to get a loan for horizontal infrastructure development. Certainly there's a lot of funding tools in the toolbox that are authorized at the state legislature. We're not using all of those. One of the things that we appreciate about the Pima Prospers document is that they do identify all of the funding mechanisms that are available. We are not utilizing all of the ones that we have at our disposal. CFDs being one of them. There's a lot of tension in counties are allowed to authorize community facilities districts for the payment of infrastructure. To date, that has not happened. But as this delta grows larger, I think we're going to have to utilize all of those. One of the concerns in Metropolitan Pima Alliance and Southern Arizona Home Builders were very involved in the review of the Pima Prospers document. In the document, there's a reference to complete streets. It's a term of art in the document. Naive that I was, in one of my first meetings, I was like, what's complete streets? It doesn't sound good if you're writing the check. Not that I want incomplete streets, but I'd like to know what's in a complete street. And so right now, this is the subdivision and development street standards that tick and tie complete streets to the requirements for infrastructure, roadway infrastructure around our projects. And there is still a lot of controversy and tension between the public sector and private sector regarding the standard that is being developed there that is also embedded in the comprehensive plan. So you're right, infrastructure to serve our projects, what the cost is and how much is front-loaded and borne by the private sector is an identified issue, but is clearly not resolved.
I'll piggyback on that. A couple of responses. One at Tony's point. Priscilla makes a very good point about how there's so many tools out there that aren't even being looked at and utilized. They're being utilized across the country. And I think there's an impediment there to get even bigger in the picture that still needs to change here in Tucson and Pima County with respect to attracting new businesses and employment in an effective way. And that's to start accepting the fact that communities across the country anymore compete for such things. Very few employers come to a place like Tucson because they look around and see the gorgeous mountains and say, we want to come here. And if you just give us a few tidbits here and there, we'll come there and bring our 550, high-end jobs. It doesn't work that way. What is being done all over the country is communities competing and making deals and offering incentives. We've never been that kind of community. We did it back in the 70s. We did it with IBM. That kind of went sour, and a lot of people still have a very bad taste in their mouth from those kinds of things having been done in the past, where we basically gave them the keys to the kingdom, and then not all that long later, they're running out of the community. So, but across the country, it's happening, where things like Intel up in Chandler and all over, where basically communities are viewing themselves in business competition with other communities. And that's a mindset here that has not really developed yet. We're willing to do things to a point in terms of concessions, but there's a much bigger point or a much bigger level we've got to get to before we're really going to start attracting the big fish. So I think all of this stuff ties together. And if there was more of the mindset of really truly being in competition, we'd be using more of the tools that were available that Priscilla was alluding to try and attract and put together packages that work. As far as, the whole component with the infrastructure and the complete streets, yeah, I really am the big picture guy. Priscilla reads these documents word for word. I mean, she's really, I'm not. I'll read through it once, I get the big flavor, and then when I have individual projects, I'll get down and roll up my sleeves and make sure I understand what I need to understand on the specifics level. But to me, so much of the comp plan when it comes to things like complete streets is, one, it's a policy document, and you need to keep that in mind. My feeling is always when I get down to the nuts and bolts level, I'm going to sit down with staff and I'm going to hammer out in discussions what can be applied, what should be applied, what is just way over the top for a particular development given its market and everything else that goes into it. And on things like complete streets and other things that are in the document, to me the real thing to keep your ears peeled for is when things like that start to become ordinance. If there's discussions to make them into ordinance, now that's a whole nother level. One thing to have a policy document that I can go sit down and talk with staff and come to an accommodation on where I do my best to balance and at the same time, but when it's ordinance, that discussion doesn't occur. It's just applied, period. And so I think it's very important. What are you pointing to me at? When you try to translate things to ordinance, that's where you really need to pique your attention and get involved and make sure that what is being translated to ordinance is being done in a way that really works for the market. So maybe you're going to enlighten us in that regard.
Goal 1, implementation measure, update the zoning code and subdivision standards.
To include complete streets?
To conform to the comp plan and serve as its primary implementation tool.
Right.
So,
when they try to bring complete streets forward and
It's not
apply
just
it from the
complete.
big down to the little, I understand.
it's the whole enchilada.
But my point is, that's where the discussion really needs to get serious, is when we get to those points, turning it into hard ordinance where there is no discussion.
Two quick points to kind of respond to both of these and that discussion. This valley has to start thinking regional, not my turf and your turf. And that is embedded in, not only in Imagine Greater Tucson, but it is embedded in this comprehensive plan. There are regional opportunities that we talk about in a number of different places. Because my friend, Mr. Mars, is absolutely correct. We face an issue in the southwest area, for example, on this is an area that is never going to be annexed by anybody. It is an area that is going to develop or should develop and is partially developed already. And Tucson Water is saying, but not by us, not going to get your water from us. The water lines go freaking right through it, you know, and it's their water lines. So it's been an issue. But the reality is that we're going to have to find ways through wheeling water to other water companies and things like that to be creative in terms of getting infrastructure into those areas. The second point is in terms of complete streets. There's been a brouhaha lately. A few people know about it with this committee that's working on the subdivision street standards. If you look at and there are things that have been said that are just not the case. Pima Prospers does talk about complete streets. Complete streets are arterials and collectors, not subdivision, residential streets. There's no place in this discussion that says that. There's also no place in this that it says there should not be cul-de-sacs or anything else. So the bottom line is that people infer things, and Priscilla and I have had this conversation a number of times. We're really buddies, okay? And the point I think I want to make is that it's like, well, we might like you because we trust you, but we're not sure we can trust anybody else. The reality is that these things will be implemented by many people in the public sector and with help from the private sector and other stakeholders through the life of this plan. And it can't rely on personalities and documents. It has to live, and it will be interpreted. And I think reasonable interpretations at the end of the day, like they have in this case, will be made.
There are a number of questions that we've had in addition from the audience that were sent up, and I won't have time for all of them today, but one of them is kind of on that inference topic. Are there the ambiguities in the current plan that are going to be removed? Are there any new ambiguities being created with this change that you could comment on?
I'll take that. There are old ambiguities, and there will be new ambiguities, and there will always be ambiguities. From my perspective, it's all about implementation. Right? You put together a comprehensive plan. It's a vision. It's a goal. What was the term you used? Aspirational? Yeah, it's aspirational. No community does a plan where it says, we are just happy to be average and maybe even mediocre. And you know what? We just want to be kind of run of the mill and have nobody writes a comprehensive plan like that. They look around to what's happening nationally. They see really cool stuff that's going on in different areas, and a lot of those ideas are grabbed and says, we like that. We would like to see that and that picture is put up there. So it's a good guiding document. And at the same time, to me, the key to a really successful comprehensive plan is when you can have that vision up there, and at the same time, when we get down to the nuts and bolts level of developing a specific piece of property, there's a rational, intelligent, measured application of those concepts in a way that they make sense for a particular site. There's things I can do if I'm doing a project in the foothills that I cannot do if I'm doing on a project on a part of town where the median income is at the low level of our spectrum, and the price points of the housing have to be in a certain level in order to have a market for it, and that's what's needed there. Then there's a whole different set of things that might be visionary and aspirational in the plan that just have to be put by the wayside. And as long as we can continue to have discussions with staff on a case-by-case basis, where you say, this makes sense, this doesn't, and everybody's on the same page that market realities do play into this, then we're good. And I think where we get into trouble is when you have some folks that are a little bit more over-enthusiastic, that are trying to place things over the top of a project that just make no economic sense for the market. And as long as we got that balance in there, I think we're good. When that scale starts to tip towards too dictatorial, that's when we start to have problems.
There's an acronym that I use when we're, Arlen and Carla and I in the industry are sitting down talking about it, and it's OPM, which is other people's money, which,
Not a lot of that around anymore.
no, but when planners when we're aspirational and we're designing a community that we want to see developed and built, there's a balance between that vision and who's going to pay for it. And on the private sector particularly, and Arlen alluded to it, is coming out of the recession, we're very leery about aspirational documents that may apply to land that has been held through the recession as we try to come out of it. And we were very open with the county and with the planning center. I think we're fortunate that a local consultant wrote this because they lived through the recession with us and understood it. We were very, very upfront about saying, you know, we sort of have post-traumatic stress disorder from the recession, and when you put these things in there, we are going to be scared that we are going to have to upfront load the costs. I think that Jim is right, that the good thing about this is that you know what the county's going to be looking for, and you know when you bring a project in and you get down to negotiation at a project level, you know where your points of negotiation are going to be. The bad thing is that it's aspirational, and county staff doesn't live in our world where you have the immediate market financial reality of your project as you try to bring it to market. And that, project by project, case by case, department by department, staff by staff, that is going to be negotiated. And that was one of the things that we talked quite a bit about, is the same staff members that provided input to the county to write these chapters are going to be negotiating your plat notes. So if they want edible landscapes, and that's in here, when you sit down to negotiate your plat notes, you're going to have a conversation about edible landscapes in your landscape plan. That's just kind of where we're headed.
I respectfully, partially disagree.
So surprised.
We wrote sections in the implementation, chapter 10 of this plan, that specifically address when things apply and when things don't apply. If you're not rezoning land, it does not apply. And so if there's a rezoning condition, yep, that's going to show up as a plat note perhaps, or some other thing. But if it is not a rezoning condition, if it wasn't considered in that process, then it will not show up. And if somebody tries to do it, they're flat out wrong, and there's a section in the interpretation section that says the planning director can decide, and that's even appealable. You'll recall that in the first slide that I put up, I talked about scarce resources. It's not, we all have scarce resources. The private sector has scarce resources, the public sector has scarce resources. And so that applies to all. One of the things that in our many meetings with the home builders back last December, and we really did have a good conversation, and we made significant changes, I think, to address not all, but many of their concerns. We put in language in the implementation document for this plan that says all based on scarce resources. The other promise that I made, and we will keep, because we're going to revise that implementation matrix and bring it back to the board for approval, is that we understand it's been a hellish time. And based on that, anything that smacks of new regulatory framework, we will put off. It will not be the first priorities. It will come down the road. And when the industry has reasonably recovered, you can, if I say reasonably, Priscilla will comment about that, but it's
5,000 new
ambiguous.
single-family housing permits a year is recovery.
Okay, well, we're not going to get there. So, but the bottom line is that we're not going to do those things, and those will get put off towards the latter part of the implementation period of the plan. And I could talk on and on, but I won't.
There's a new route that's being planned from Mexico, and I'm not sure, I believe it goes to Phoenix, I believe
Louder,
it's called
Steve.
I-111. Does this plan address the need for this area to benefit from that proposed route?
The concept is embedded in the discussions at ADOT. I don't know that I-11 actually only exists to Wickenburg, I think, or somewhere near there. But the intent, I think, of the number of people in the community is to ensure that it extends down through Pima County to the border. Well, if you're in Yuma, you wanted it extended through Yuma County, but still to the border. The issue for us is that in a 20-year plan horizon, in a plan that will be redone 10 years from now, we do not know where this route will be. If Mr. Huckleberry had his way, it would probably be out in the Avro Valley. If the mayor had his way, it would be double-decked over the existing I-10, and then there's other proposals out there as well. Our problem is that we can't respond to something that is that vague and ambiguous. We have a section in the beginning chapter here called Game Changers, and there's a list of 6 or 7 items that things that could happen, some positive, some negative, but we try to put them in a positive spin. But I-11 is one of those game changers, and if that comes to pass where we actually know where the reasonable alignment is, and we can start planning land uses around it, and that sort of thing, then that's how we've addressed it in the plan. So it's addressed, but not comprehensively.
Is there any possibility going forward that the mitigation and set-aside thresholds for the conservation land systems would be lessened?
Anything is possible. There's language in the plan that says that if we're going to change aspects of the conservation land system, that they have to be done in a comprehensive manner, that we look at the whole thing. And that's important to note because we're in the process of seeking the MSCP.
Section 10 permit.
Basically the Section 10 permit for our Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan. And the Fish and Wildlife Service we have indication from them that they're comfortable with the language we have in this plan. If we were to go back and change something in that, it would be changed comprehensively, and it would involve the Fish and Wildlife Service and such. The reality is that, and this is where you talk about implementation from a guideline standpoint. Everything associated with the conservation land system is guidelines. The county treats them as guidelines. The Coalition for Sonoran Desert Protection does not. They treat them as in minimums. So there's a battle on each of these things. When things come up to item, Jim has lived this repeatedly.
Give me that microphone.
I know, I will in a second. And it is, it's sometimes as if there were two staffs. So, us and the coalition. But I understand their perspective and such. I don't see that they're gonna change in any time soon unless we are comprehensively looking at it, and Fish and Wildlife Service frankly agrees to anything that we do.
That really is, for everything that's in here, if you really want to talk about one thing that really is a kick in the teeth, as far as its economic impact on private properties, it is the CLS in terms of the thresholds that it demands if you're in certain categories. Anything that takes 2/3 or 4/5 of your land and just says you can't touch it, while you've been paying on 20 acres for 25 years, and now you can develop 4, when it's all said and done, that's a real problem. And that's an objective statement. I'm not making an editorial comment on the CLS and what its objectives are. I think those objectives are laudable. I'm talking about the implementation of it. And it's implemented in a way that is really, really difficult for the private landowner and for the ultimate development of so many properties in the community. When Arlen says Pima County looks at it as guidelines, that is true. I can sit with Arlen's people, I can sit with Sherry Ruther, and we can work out compromises in ways that those guidelines are treated flexibly. The coalition's is a very hard and fast interpretation of those guidelines. They do not view them as guidelines. They view them for all intents and purposes as ordinance. And when you go to the Board of Supervisors, who are the ultimate arbiter on how those will be applied, I would tell me if you think I'm over exaggerating here, but the majority of the board members has the ear of the coalition. And so, in effect, those guidelines are being applied by ordinance, rezoning after rezoning after rezoning. Even though I can get flexibility from staff, the board looks past staff's recommendation and it tends to go with the recommendations and requests of the coalition. So in reality, in practical terms, it's being applied today as ordinance. And as long as that is the case, I think we have a major issue there. To the extent that there can be some little bit of flexibility introduced into those guidelines where they can actually be negotiated on a case-by-case basis would make a huge difference. So we've not seen that ever since the CLS was adopted.
The word is that U.S. Fish and Wildlife is going to approve Pima County's Section 10 permit. When that happens, which is anticipated to be this year, all of the set-aside acreage and all of the standards on private lands, whether it's multiple use or BioCore, will be federalized. They will be under the purview of the federal government and not the local Board of Supervisors.
Are they effectively ordinance then, or are they guidelines?
They will stay as guidelines in Pima County, but they fall under the purview of the approved HCP plan, which falls under the federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife jurisdiction.
Just real quick, I could get into a whole long conversation about the conservation land system. But the bottom line is that we've got a number of different tools in the toolbox for meeting, some of which are already there in terms of set-asides for mitigation of lands in the CLS. The one last thing I want to say is the immediate past state land commissioner, for the first time, said that she wanted to make available state trust land, at auction, at fair market value, for mitigation for private property, not just state land property. The new state land commissioner's name is Lisa Adkins. She's a wonderful person. She's a U of A graduate, and she knows the area. And I think when she takes office, seeing that she looks at that policy of the previous land commissioner and carries it forward, I think is huge for the community. You no longer have to be negotiating exorbitant prices for that mitigation land. I want to thank you guys very much for listening, I think, to all of us, and I know you want to wrap up.
Yeah.
So appreciate it.